So, hi everyone, thank you so much for coming. It's a real pleasure to see many familiar faces, and thank you, Gobin, for a kind introduction. So it's been really fun to put together this panel, which attempts to engage with media and information in authoritarian regimes in a slightly different way by carrying out this comparison with three different regimes, kind of on a spectrum from authoritarianism to sort of hybrid regimes, as they're called, a mix of democracy and non-democratic rule. So the way we kind of structured it is that it's going from China to Russia to Turkey. And it's debatable to what extent this is the right progression at this point. And we're going to talk a lot about how the three regimes might be learning from one another in the ways in which they manage information. But the idea initially was that we start with the sort of the most authoritarian state, considered to be kind of closed by many comparative researchers, and then move on to, a little bit more open. And I guess at this point, Russia and Turkey are sort of bordering the same line of hybridness, or whatever is left of that category. So today I will talk about information management in China and really try to kind of tackle this notion of China model as a model for other nations to adapt in managing the internet or other forms of information. So when we think about China model, I think what comes to mind the most is other states learning from China how to manage the internet. So particularly it reminds us of surveillance technology and the ways in which China might be exporting certain technology to other nations, or how other countries might be taking some of its tactics and tools as well as legal frameworks to control the way the information flows within their borders. But what I would like to sort of challenge a little bit is this notion of a model. Is managing information solely control, or are there more aspects to it? So I would like to present a little bit more broader view on how the Chinese party state has dealt with information, and particularly emphasize the changes that have taken place under the new leadership, under Xi's rule. And indeed, we have seen quite a few transformations in the regime's approach to information, which are important to highlight. They're still ongoing, but I think today it's good to kind of tackle them a little bit and see whether there are new ways that are emerging in the party state, ways of dealing with the media and state-society relations more broadly. So the three kind of aspects I would like to highlight are control, persuasion, and information gathering in terms of how the state deals with information. So starting with control, what we see here, of course, is a snippet of a page that cannot be opened online. And thinking of control, censorship most immediately comes to mind, right? The government's ways of dealing with information has been very adaptive in the past years, decades. It has been quite fluid and flexible and smart at managing information both online and in traditional media, adjusting to public opinion currents, to sensitivity of the political climate, in China, to certain public events. Things have been quickly kind of molded and shifted. So it's by no means a monolithic kind of way of managing the media, but it's much more flexible and ever-changing. So within one day, an issue can transform from being a normal to sensitive to sort of semi-sensitive online. So it's a very interesting kind of system, dynamic, and in many ways difficult to study and to capture. But I think adaptive is an important concept that captures that, to a close extent. The second notion is persuasion. I think we don't talk enough about it, but it's really, in old school terms, it's propaganda, right? So propaganda has been part of the regime's governance for decades, and it has evolved as well over time. It hasn't been, static either. So the way it has evolved and is by mechanisms by which the government has tried to persuade the public through various positive messages, through directives given to the media, covering certain events in a more, uplifting manner, which is a very popular directive sent down to journalists, but also through new media. So engaging officials actively in social media platforms to directly talk to the public, which is other forms of persuasion. So propaganda is also a wide category that I think is very important to engage in when we think about information management. And lastly, perhaps a little bit less intuitively, is what I call information gathering. And by information gathering, I don't mean solely surveillance, but the idea of the party state closely watching what people are discussing on the internet and incorporating some of their discussions into policy decisions. So when something breaks out online, for instance, not only is there censorship, on certain keywords or discussions, but there's also persuasion as well as active watching of what's being discussed and how it's discussed, and then certain policies are being kind of shaped in accordance to that. So if there is a big protest, for instance, against a polluting company, the company might be very quickly shut down, or some kind of immediate action will be taken by the government in response to public discontent on the internet. So I would say that all those three different facets are kind of operating simultaneously, and they're highly interconnected in this larger apparatus of information gathering and management. So in the past 2 years, what has changed? I would argue that in the past 2 years, there's been a shift towards perhaps a more centralized and more systematic ways of dealing with information under C, with a lot more emphasis actually on post-factum repression and coercion, which we haven't seen to the same degree in the past. So I will go through all the 3 different facets I've mentioned and try to kind of update them, so to speak about different adaptations taken by the state in the past 2 years or so. So starting here with Control 2.0, as I call it. Control 2.0 says the internet. There have been many discussions in the Chinese political sphere about better managing the internet. These discussions have taken place under the previous leadership as well, but now there's kind of a new revamped approach to managing it. So first of all, more preemptive tactics, such as new legal restrictions, new legal frameworks to basically contain so-called potentially threatening discourse. Journalists are now being tightly controlled in terms of what kind of information they can share from their investigations and their interviews. They actually have to ask for permission from their employers to share much information online. They used to be able to spill over, so to speak, information more easily on social media. Now that's becoming quite sensitive. There are also new mechanisms to basically implement real name registration online. Starting with March 1st, they're going to try to take harsher measures on social media. So the idea of really putting in your real name and not creating new accounts to bypass restrictions. This is another mode. And of course, we're seeing also the target here, on Western technology. So most recently, a lot of you might have read the news about VPN access, the crackdown on VPNs being done also in a fairly coherent kind of manner. VPNs have always suffered, and to some degree, they've kind of appeared and disappeared. They've been ad hoc kind of ways of managing them. But now there have been high-level speeches and statements made that indeed this technology is illegal. It needs to be contained as effectively as possible. And access to a number of VPN servers has been increasingly more difficult. It's still accessible, but it's harder. So Gmail as well, the use of Gmail on the phones has become difficult also. There's also some shift towards centralization as manifested by the establishment of a new internet committee that deals with internet policy at a high level, composed of high-level party officials, kind of trying to centralize and create a new shift of how to manage the internet in the long term, creating a kind of long-term vision. And in addition to that, we're seeing a really revamped censorship, particularly attack on Weibo, China's Twitter-like platform, which has indeed been kind of like a public discourse sort of space for Chinese netizens, citizens more broadly, as well as officials. And now we're seeing a decline in the number of users, and this platform is suffering quite a lot of restrictions. The campaign started with the idea of spreading false rumors, so constraining the spread of false rumors, which can in fact result in detentions and in jail time, and a number of bloggers have been jailed. So it's a lot more kind of serious, harsher approach to the usage of social media here. And of course, the notion of false rumors is fairly subjective because it's a broad category under which many things can fall, basically. It's a little bit similar, I think, in some ways to extremism concept in Russia, where you have this broad concept which can really incorporate all sorts of discontent. So very tricky and slippery slope there. But in addition to a number of bloggers jailed, we're also seeing more repression against journalists and a number of liberal journalists arrested. Actually, the number of journalists in jail is the highest, I think, ever in decades now in the past 2 years. Here we're seeing a photo of Shen Hao and his colleague from 21st Century Weekly, a very popular Shanghai newspaper that's engaged in all sorts of reporting, particularly on economic issues. But he's really been a symbol for many Chinese journalists, and his arrest under the veil of anti-corruption campaign, I think, has sent some signal to other reporters of the threshold for tolerance being lowered in the Chinese state. That's not to say that everybody's afraid of detention, but in my research under Hu administration, detention and arrests really rarely came up in the conversations and interviews. Now, being in touch with various journalists online, I find that there's not an explicit fear, but at least there's more concern about harsher measures being taken against them, due to this kind of cases. So really interesting new developments here in the realm of control. We're also seeing so-called persuasion 2.0, long-live ideology. So new modes of persuasion, as I mentioned, propaganda has adapted over decades, but we're seeing even new adaptations taking place in the past 2 years. So first of all, new effective platforms for persuasion. And these range from media, traditional media, to new media, and in particularly in the realm of traditional media, the party has actually endorsed and set up new newspapers, such as The Paper in Shanghai, which is a digital newspaper, very clean-cut layout and quite convincing with a lot of emotional jargon, but also targeting corruption campaigns in a sense that they're reporting on state-endorsed corruption campaigns, as well as integrating more sophisticated propaganda of various activities of high-ranking officials, including C, and it's being read pretty widely. It's doing well commercially. This is kind of a new endeavor. We haven't really seen that in the past, but also upgrading the existing newspapers like Remin Ribao, People's Daily, creating an app to engage the readers, the sense of kind of modernizing this old-school media and making it more popular amongst wider readers, not just officials and cynics who are kind of making fun of it or using it as satire. There's also a new campaign to engage officials again online, as I mentioned before, but it's even more effort to kind of have them set up their own accounts on social media as well as WeChat platforms and to just actively interact with the public as part of their assessments, their job assessments, and in order to get any kind of promotion, this is also another unit that's being measured now. So it's really important to do well in this regard, to progress in the official system. So in addition to that, we're seeing new kind of slogans that are more emotional and sort of more modern, I would say. So for example, the slogan of China Dream is a kind of a contrast to the previous slogans such as scientific development or the more drier kind of party slogans that I think were less appealing to the public. This is a very open-ended, nationalistic term, which I think anybody can interpret in their own manner. This is just a snapshot of a poster that's hung in Beijing, but the debate about China Dream has been really encouraged by the state, and there have been many opinion pieces written. What does it mean to have a China Dream for this kind of citizens, China Dream for the world, China Dream in Asia? There's just this whole movement of promoting this China Dream, and I think it is an upgrade from the previous forms of ideology promotion, and it's interesting to watch what new slogans are emerging and how they're being pushed through the media and social media alike. We're also seeing, in addition to this kind of attempts at wider persuasion, there's also crackdown on Western values. Again, nothing super new here, but it seems to be a more comprehensive attempt at kind of ruling out Western values, but Western values being termed quite broadly. Again, what does it mean to crack down on Western values? It could include many aspects that have already been incorporated, particularly in the education system. Having researched journalism education in my previous work, I found a lot of so-called Western values being really adapted into actual textbooks. So how it's going to be implemented is unclear, but there have been a lot of statements made about that being part of the kind of ideological campaigns, as well as the reinforcement of so-called Marxist values. So journalists have to undergo more education training in party ideology in order to renew their journalist permits and to continue their work. Again, nothing particularly new, but just a stronger, kind of more comprehensive effort emphasizing that. So new attempts at ideology kind of accompanied by new forms of control. And in addition, there is also a new mode of information gathering, the so-called information gathering 2.0. Whereas in the past, I would argue was more adaptive, with public discussions appearing online and the government kind of responding to them. Now there's also a more scientific, data-driven approach to grasping public opinion from the top down, with officials kind of surveying the public on issues that matter to them, and then making decisions accordingly. It's a very different system from the more bottom-up kind of fluid way of understanding public opinion. And in fact, we have researchers here who are engaged in that directly, and I'm really looking forward to understanding and learning from their efforts about data gathering as implemented by officials and the process of how that's done. So it's a very interesting new mode, and that's not to say that the government is not watching bottom-up kind of pressures or discussions, but they're complementing it by a different system now, a different approach, which is in many ways kind of less transparent, which puts it into question what is being surveyed and how and whose opinions count, which is interesting to take into account. So where does this leave any forms of creative resistance in the Chinese system? We've always seen all sorts of bottom-up pressures on the state and all kinds of forms of satire, investigative reporting ongoing despite the pressures and the difficult kind of media landscape that journalists are facing. What's happening now? It's a little bit hard, I think, to grasp it from the distance, but we are seeing some obvious shifts. For example, a number of users moving from Weibo to Yesil as a chat platform, but it's much more segmented. It's kind of like private discussion groups where you have to be invited or accepted, into a group, and then you can engage in various discussions there. But it doesn't sort of reach out to the wider public opinion like Weibo used to do. It's a very different platform. So in some argue it's more private. At the same time, the government has been catching up with a number of new crackdowns taking place recently. More officials infiltrating the platform and more efforts on behalf of the government to reinforce real name registration there as well. So there's, I think, a lot of tension, cat and mouse game taking place specifically on that platform. And other than that, there's still investigative reporting that does go on and practiced by a number of news outlets such as Caixin and Caiding. That said, some of the investigations really target high-level corrupt officials that are already being targeted by the regime. So it's kind of like a collaborative effort in a way. And it's not always clear to what extent they're starting the investigation or kind of following up on something that the authorities have already initiated. So it's a little bit of a different thing than investigating something local or something specific, to them. They're kind of engaging in high-level efforts already sanctioned by officials. But the movement of investigative reporting is still there, but in a much more marginal way, I would say. There's also some sentiment of more cross-sector movements, by which I mean more activists, journalists, and like lawyers uniting together and trying to work together on certain issues, which was already the case in the past. But at the same time, that's accompanied by more self-censorship. So a lot of sensitive issues are not touched upon, I think, in the same way as they used to be before. And there's more fear of, again, who's next or what's like the right boundary and how to measure it at this point when the rules of the game seem to be shifting. And lastly, there seems to be less politicized forms of social activism emerging. In our article in Foreign Policy with Ko Chang-fang, we talked about Chinese journalists leaving Southern Weekly, a very famous investigative newspaper, and actually starting up their own companies, startups. And Ko Chang found that a lot of these startups actually engage in education and socially meaningful kind of campaigns and issues, but they're not directly kind of political, and they're not even close to being as political as, say, investigative issues, sensitive issues that investigative reporters used to tackle. So it's a sort of a new movement, and we're not sure yet whether that's just limited to this newspaper or whether many other reporters are going to join startups or become so-called creative entrepreneurs, and what that means for like the society and state-society relations. So it could be just a little glimpse, or it could be something bigger, and we're going to try to investigate it more in the future research. So on the last point, I wanted to bring the attention again back to the China as a model and the notion of authoritarian diffusion, something that's becoming kind of a popular topic nowadays in the literature. I would argue that, yes, maybe China is a model, but on very specific issues. It's kind of a selective model, particularly, again, related to technology that's being exported and related to legal frameworks and the kind of modes of control. But I think the notion of persuasion and information gathering is not really being exported as much. I don't see other regimes learning those practices from China or engaging in any kind of dialogue of how to better persuade public opinion or to gather and respond to public opinion. I think those two different facets are kind of like China-specific at this point, and it would be interesting to see if that learning occurs or doesn't occur and what the other panelists have to say about it. I also wanted to bring the attention to another issue that, hasn't been discussed at all, which is diffusion of resistance practices. So to what extent are activists and journalists and other actors that are trying to push the boundaries in undemocratic states also learning from one another? We're talking a lot about states, but how about society? Are they engaging in some kind of workshops, learning indirectly maybe, just observing their counterparts in other countries? Are they creating some kind of collaborative schemes? I found that in Russia, for example, a number of activists I spoke to were interested in learning about Chinese activists, but they didn't have direct access to them. They just didn't know who to contact, and they didn't have the sources, funding to kind of travel there. It was sort of like a black hole, but they were interested in the black hole. So there was kind of this sense of we want to unpack it, but how to do it, we don't know. So they would invite other speakers who focus on China to talk to them and to kind of explain the different tactics that are being used. So I think it's a really rich area, potentially, of research that could be looked at, but it's quite difficult to tackle, maybe something to think about. And finally, I wanted to bring the attention to concepts. Is it diffusion or is it convergence? Are more and more non-democratic states just embracing similar modes of controlling the information, or is one diffusing across from another? So there have been all kinds of discussions of Xi Jinping learning, in some ways, from Putin about the more centralized, kind of systematic way of controlling the media, and also more coercion that's used in the Russian case, post factum coercion and repression. Is this the case of also kind of cross mutual learning, or is it just that they're becoming more and more similar? So I think I wanted to leave it at that, and then to open discussion to the next panelist, to Jackie. Thank you.
Okay. Hi, guys. Maria, thanks. That was fascinating. So I'm going to talk to you about what's going on in Russia along these same lines today. You see here an image from the 2011-2012 protest movement around fraudulent elections, in which activists used social media to an enormous extent, got crowds of over 100,000 total in streets of major cities in Russia. Which is the clicker here? This? Okay. Come back to that in a moment. And I'll point out that this protest movement was a major sea change, as I'll show you, in the way in which Russia has started to control the media and other information technologies over the last couple of years. So this is what I'm going to talk about, basically run through a little bit about the background of media control in Russia over the last decade or so, and then discuss how that's been changing since the protest movement and the new mechanisms of control that have been used. And then I'll come to the comparison with other countries and authoritarian learning or diffusion. And the possibility that maybe there is something of a Russian model that is diffusing or at least is emulatable. So to start out, in the period when Putin first came to power in the early 2000s, you see something of contradictory tendencies in Russian media control. On the one hand, you see threatening media, media like television that is dealing with issues that are seen as hot-button issues, like the when the Kursk submarine went down and Russia was unable to get back the sailors before everyone passed away, or the Nord-Ost hostage crisis in Moscow in 2003, or the Beslan massacre at a school in the city of Beslan in southern Russia. All of these were events where you had television outlets in Russia and all other media outlets covering them in great detail, and the Putin government was very upset by this because it made them look bad and like they didn't have control over the situation. So you had a rapid sort of seizing of control of TV and to some extent radio during the early Putin period. And you also had the crackdown on things which were very public forms of satire, like you see at the top here, one of my favorite TV shows that was on in Russia when I first went there in 2000 and was soon taken off the air was Kukli, a puppet show that made fun of politicians of the day. I think the Putin puppet being added was the last straw. But during this era, you had investigative reporters nonetheless. They weren't always safe. This is a plaque in the, is this a pointer? Yeah. I don't know if it works. This is a plaque outside of the offices of Novaya Gazeta in Moscow of Anna Politinskaya, who was murdered in her home after being one of the bravest reporters covering the war in Chechnya. On the other hand, in spite of all of this, you had openings. You had some significant space for investigative reporting, print media that was still somewhat free, owned by foreign organizations, et cetera. And so this map shows even today, this was in early 2014, April 2014, some sort of model of how independent some of the media has been in Russia. You see in the bottom right-hand corner there, sources which are seen as both independent and relatively highbrow. And so there have still been sources of this sort out there. And this is even now, after several years, that it's been getting stricter. How long this lasts remains to be seen. At the same time, during the 2000s, internet was a free-for-all. Now, this has been referred to as an example of asymmetry in the level of civil liberties online versus offline. You had very limited restrictions of the internet. And I'll come to that in a second, but the ICT sector was seen as somewhat protected. Putin called a meeting with high-level elites early in his rule and discussed whether to follow a sort of Chinese model or not, and decided that they would not follow a Chinese model and would allow the economic development that came with the development of the ICT sector. And so you had people in the early 2000s, journalists, referring to the internet as the last free place to do media, real reporting, and people starting all sorts of new outlets online. You see a couple of examples of those. Linta.ru and Granny.ru were two websites. Granny.ru was sort of the more fringe, more controversial commentary. Linta.ru was more mainstream. It was the most popular online news site. You had social media from the very get-go in Russia because the Russian internet penetration rate was increasing at around the time that social media was taking off in the West. And so the two hit Russia simultaneously for most users. And so you had LiveJournal, which, how many of you have heard of LiveJournal? A few of you. It was popular in the early 2000s, one of the first social media platforms in the US, but it took off in Russia. Something about this blogging space, social blogging, it really became a big thing there. And the Russian blogosphere consisted, the biggest section of it was LiveJournal. And VKontakte was a Facebook clone founded in Russia that took off well before Facebook entered the Russian market. So I said there were some restrictions. Russia has sometimes, and the former Soviet region in general, have sometimes been referred to as exemplars of what's referred to as a next-generation approach to restrictions. So this is a model that's been developed by researchers at the OpenNet initiative at University of Toronto Citizen Lab. Here you see on the left, these are the sorts of approaches that are characteristic of the Chinese firewall, for example. First generation blunt blocking, keyword filtering, manual content censorship. On the other hand, you have what's referred to as next generation approaches, which are generally things like restrictive legal measures, trials of key figures, physical attacks offline, but not blocking sites, denial of service attacks, various things like this that are a little bit more plausibly deniable, but and more subtle, but can have some chilling effect. These things existed in Russia, although they still were trivial by comparison to a lot of states of similar regime type. So you see here, if you look at filtering, so the real censorship, Russia, if you were to compare the online filtering level to civil liberties score. This is a Freedom House civil liberties score, and this is a global measure of filtering done by Citizen Lab. You see that Russia falls well below what you would expect as the normal regression line if there was a one-to-one correlation between the two. So it's very asymmetric in this regard. So are a bunch of other states in red there that are from the former Soviet region. And what you see during this period is a massive expansion of civic engagement. Russian society has been seen as notoriously unactive, unengaged in civic engagement during the 2000s, and this started to change. You see, for example, on the left upper corner there, a map of called the help map for fires in Russia in the summer of 2010, where people crowd mapped incidents of fires so that people could come with bucket brigades and help. And then you see a slightly more political issue in the bottom left corner. A road was being planned between Moscow and St. Petersburg that would cut through the scenic Khimki forest, which had previously been a protected zone. And you had a massive protest movement by Russian standards at the time, thousands of people coming to events, concerts in the woods to protect the woods from bulldozers, et cetera. And perhaps the most political issue of all of these was another sort of bucket brigade. The Blue Bucket Brigade was a protest movement against the use of so-called majigalki on the tops of cars, these flashing blue lights that had been involved in several major incidents where civilians were killed by elites speeding through intersections with their lights flashing, and it was a elite corruption issue. And there were massive, very creative protests during this time, all of these organized through social media. And then you had the protest movement. Now, you see on the left here the map of the blogosphere. This is the LiveJournal, like I said, the largest portion of the blogosphere in Russia right before the protest movement emerged in 2011, done by the Berkman Center at Harvard. And it shows that there's already, in the upper left there, there's already a highly developed public affairs segment with people discussing political issues. But then this really starts to spill into the streets in a more lively sort of public discourse. You see also the use of these new technologies in the protest movement. On the right is the Golos crowd map of electoral violations using the Ushahidi crowd mapping platform. Now, at the time, the Russian government didn't have much to do in response to this. There were some denial of service attacks against some of the sites being used by activists on election day, but they made fun of it. They thought the internet, well, what is the internet? How does it affect us? And an official made a statement about they're just little network hamsters, which has a connotation sort of similar to lemmings in Russian. And here you see Alexei Navalny, who was one of the protest leaders and previously had come to fame by being an anti-corruption blogger. And he is shouting back at the crowd to mass cheers, yes, I'm a little network hamster, and I'll gnaw through the throats of these brutes. So the government then started to see that they needed to do something about this. And that's when you see this massive about-face on internet policy, starting in 2012 after the protest movement subsided and Putin came back into power. So you see several different dynamics in this time. Major changes in internet policy, major changes in control of the ICT sector, and a crackdown on all sorts of fringe, any types of independent media that had previously been tolerated. And this idea of an information war, which is sort of tied up with propaganda, especially around the Ukraine crisis. So just to give you a sense of the kinds of dramatic changes that have happened recently in internet policy, activists and journalists in Moscow who I was interviewing this past year, they refer to it as the crazy printer. That's what they call the Duma now, because it just making laws every week, new laws, passing them in the first reading, this sort of thing. And at first, the first law was adopted in 2012, which allowed blocking, censorship. And it was a child protection law. But there were no illusions in activist circles that this was going to be expanded in scope somehow. And it quickly did. First, it was child pornography, things about illegal drugs, but it's been expanded to include, for example, the LGBT propaganda law, which you probably have heard about. At this point, over 4,000 sites are on the block list. And because the clunky technologies being used to implement the block list, like IP-level blocking, over 145,000 sites have been affected in one way or another at various times. You also have seen an anti-piracy law, sort of similar to the SOPA PIPA law, which failed to pass here, but sailed through there in spite of a protest campaign. A particularly pernicious law on pretrial blocking of websites that are deemed to contain extremist material, like Maria mentioned. This was used on the so-called Black Thursday this past year in March during the Crimea crisis to block several major oppositional news outlets all of a sudden claimed to be extremist because of some link on their site, some piece of material, and then there's no way for them to get unblocked readily. There was a package of anti-terrorist laws passed this past summer, which included the so-called bloggers law, which requires that now all bloggers who have a daily audience of over 3,000 must register as official bloggers and must follow rules from media like checking the veracity of all the material on their site. And it's been leading to all sorts of questions about who registers as a blogger. All of these laws, one of the things to note is even though they're written in legalistic language, the language, if you talk to a lawyer, makes no sense because terms aren't defined. And it's clear that they are aimed at particular individuals or types of individuals or groups. So Navalny, who I showed you, would be one example of this. Also in that package was the user data storage requirement, which is going to come into force in September of this year, which is seen as an attack on international social media platforms in Russia, requiring that they store data of all Russian users in servers on Russian soil for 6 months, which will, of course, allow the government to follow, et cetera. So there have been a bunch of these new laws. There's also been a change in the approach to the ICT sector that's really dramatic. Now, the ICT sector has been one of the fastest growing sectors in the Russian economy over recent years. So you'd think maybe this is shooting themselves in the foot economically, but they don't seem to care. And by comparison to the natural resource sector, it's minuscule. And so VKontakte, which I mentioned before, Facebook clone, which is wildly popular, much more popular than Facebook in Russia, founded by the Russian Mark Zuckerberg, people call Pavel Durov. He was forced to sell his shares in the company and fled the country last winter and claimed that he would never go back and do business in Russia again. And it was all about having to block pages of people protesting what was going on in Ukraine. You had discussion of the internet as a CIA project by Putin at a conference around the same time. Yandex News. Yandex is the Russian Google. It's been around for almost as long as Google has. It's a major search engine there that's much more popular than Google, has a news aggregator, and there was discussion of making the news aggregator an official media site that had to follow all the same rules as official media, which would basically mean it was impossible because they wouldn't be able to check the language of everything that got aggregated. So there have been a bunch of these things towards the ICT sector. Probably the most frightening thing for people in the internet community has been discussion of the so-called Cheburashka internet. This is a joke. Cheburashka is this furry character from Russian cartoons, Soviet cartoons. But there was a Duma deputy who made a bit of an idiot of himself by saying, we need a Russian cultural internet. Call it what you will, a Cheburashka internet. But then it came out that there was a high-level discussion in the presidential administration about creating a, quote, 3-level internet where only certain channels, thanks, would be allowed to interact with the outside world. So it remains to be seen at the moment what's going to happen with all of this. Crackdown on media at the same time, especially online media. Some of these I already mentioned, like the Black Thursday last spring. Also, there's a new law which is particularly significant this winter being discussed to and pushed through to take over any media which is owned by, which is foreign owned. You can only have 20% ownership, which will affect newspapers like Vedomosti, which have been relatively independent. So there's been some pushback by activists, but it's a very small circle compared to the public opinion in general, which has been very patriotic during this period. So to address this question of authoritarian learning and conclude, I think there are a few things worth noting here. One possible obvious explanation of what's going on here in the Russian case is you're just closing the gap. There's been this asymmetry. You see, Russia, other countries in the FSU region, a few years ago were so far below the line of what you would expect given other aspects of their regime type, and they're just becoming more similar online and offline. But there are other things to bear in mind, too. This speaks to what Maria said about convergence versus divergence, convergence versus diffusion. Here you see a map of filtering level versus internet penetration. Internet penetration data globally from the International Telecommunications Union, ITU. And what you see is, if you look at the countries as they are assigned by Freedom House as partly free, not free, or free, the red are the not free, the free are blue. It's a heuristic, it's not perfect, but what you see is the countries which are red, which are not free, seem to be on one trend line, and the ones which are free seem to be going in a different direction. And so you see two diverging trends. Now this is a snapshot data. This doesn't necessarily hold up longitudinally for all countries, but if you pick a few examples, like Russia here or Turkey, what you have seen, in fact, is that they have moved both further up in terms of the restriction level of the internet and further to the right in terms of the penetration level. So they have followed the trend line towards that the more authoritarian countries seem to be following. And this raises an interesting question for all the other countries here which had been hybrid regimes of one sort or another, which had been in the partly free category, and most of which had had internet penetration back then in 2011 of around 40% or below. What's happening with them? Will they follow this same trend, or can some of them follow the other trend, or is there some new model? So a Russian model, if there were one, a few things to note. I think that it's rather significant that Russia doesn't follow the same approach that China does. Even though you see site blocking now, it's exemplars. It's not systemic across the board filtering. There's some discussion of that, but it hasn't been implemented yet. And it's not really clear whether Russia has the infrastructure to do that right now. So it's technologically less sophisticated, but it's using exemplar figures, exemplar websites, exemplar media outlets to set an example to scare people. And so it also uses these other next generation controls, trolling, denial of service attacks, quite profusely. And another thing to note is in the Russian case, you see some similarities between what Russia is doing and what other countries in the FSU region are doing. And so it raises the question of either regional diffusion or diffusion across regime types, across similar regime types going forward. So I look forward very much to our discussion.
All right. Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming. And I also want to thank Maria and everyone at Park for inviting me, and also for Gobin for chairing the panel. I believe by now, this is going to be very familiar for everyone, like the increasing incursions and, like political freedoms on the public sphere, new tactics, new strategies by these, like authoritarian, I'm sorry, I just pace around. These authoritarian leaning regimes. So I want to talk a little bit about some of the changes or the new developments under the AKP era. If you're familiar with the Turkish context, it's the ruling party since 2002. They're in their third term, and new elections are coming up in June 2015. So it's Justice and Development Party headed by Erdogan. And during, Arab Spring, you might have heard, like these references to the Turkish model, that it's a successful example or an ideal model that blends together Islam and democracy, and especially neoliberal market values. During and after Arab Spring, Turkey was upheld as this, model for democratization efforts in the Middle East. But then since 2013, especially with the Gezi Park protests, the massive anti-government protests that rocked the country, and then 2014, the corruption scandal, the massive graft scandal that implicated AKP officials, even Erdogan, his inner circle, and his family. There has been this, change in discourse. So those days of, the Turkish model, the vibrant democracy of, Erdogan and the AKP, they're gone. And now we're talking about this authoritarian slide, which again is marked by, these major themes of, erosion of freedoms, disregard for the rule of law, and what a Turkish scholar calls the remoralization of society, remoralization in the sense that along Islam-inspired conservative and religious values. So I kind of find this exclusive focus on post-2013 developments in Turkey and the sole focus on the AKP a little bit problematic. Yes, things have gotten worse. But one point that I want to make is that the AKP's commitment to democratic norms, individual liberties, even in its first term when it came to power, and even when it was pursuing European Union reforms for the purposes of application, EU membership, its commitment was still tentative. It was more like, one step backwards, forwards, two step backwards. So it was very, very ambivalent. The second point is that the politicization of state institutions, violations of freedoms of press, association, what have you, the national security policies. This has been going on for Turkey for quite some time, at least since the 1980s. So there's really nothing new. They, all these problems have gotten worse during the AKP era, but they also have a long past. And third, I also want to point out that when we talk about especially media and information management in the Turkish context, I don't want to give the impression that AKP is the only actor to blame and media organizations are these hapless victims. A lot of these media organizations, especially the mainstream ones, are complicit in this too. So I'm going to be talking about this in a little while. Just going to skip a couple of things. All right. One quick note about Turkey's media system. And again, this is one point that I'm, making in my forthcoming book, that it is both, highly commercialized, very market-driven, but also statist. And this has to do with Turkey's own, political system that has been in the making, that has been, in this ongoing transformation, at least since the 1980s, with a shift from protectionist economic model to the domination of the market logic, and also the changing role of the state. And but I want to point out that we're not really talking about the decline of the nation state in the Turkish context, but rather a reconfiguration of the state, and it's taking on new roles. So when we look at the Turkish media system, which again, is a byproduct of the political system, we see a couple of things going on at the same time. Economic liberalization, very commercialized, highly market-driven, but with weak democratic consolidation, and of course, the sway of patrimonial institutions. So if you look at the AKP era, again, over the past decade or so, what the AKP is trying to do is not really total or complete media domination. They're always leaving some media outlets untouched, especially those that they perceive to be Kemalist and secularist and anti-Muslim. So this they do, I think, to leave them aside, as safety valves where some opposition can be expressed, and also to ward off a lot the criticism that they are receiving from international institutions and organizations such as Freedom House and Committee to Protect Journalists. And back in I think 2011, 2012, Turkey was the #1 jailer of journalists in the world. So they're always using this, oh, we have more than 200 newspapers. Oh, look, there are these secularist papers that are swearing the prime minister and the president every single day, but we're not touching them. So they're using them as these safety valves, also to ward off criticism and as some semblance of media freedom. Every now and then you will hear Erdogan and his associates arguing that in Turkey there is a lot more media freedom than there is in Europe and in the United States, and they are serious when they do say this, and they're always pointing out to the numbers. Look how many TV outlets we have. Look how many newspapers we have. Anyways, going back to this point, it's not total media domination, but again, as both Maria and Jackie mentioned, it's rather about persuasion and effective management. So they want to both use commercial and state media to disseminate and legitimize their own ideological narrative, which cuts across both Turkish nationalism and Muslim religious conservatism, confine the boundaries of the public sphere, and obviously penalize and marginalize critical views and silence dissent. Some of the issues that they're particularly sensitive about, they have to do with national sovereignty, unity, and identity, which harks back to the whole Kurdish issue and fears of Kurdish separatism, moral values, and the structure of the Turkish society and Turkish family have recently become more and more pronounced. So this is what Turan refers to as the remoralization of the society. Also lately, blasphemy and the protection of Islam have become another hot button issue for AKP and its proxy government agencies. Certain individuals are targeted and persecuted for offending the religious sensitivities of the Muslim population. So they especially go after certain Twitter users. And it also rests on an idealized Ottoman past. This has to do with, the AKP's foreign policy. So even, if somebody, I will talk about this later, but if you're familiar with the popular Turkish television drama, The Magnificent Century, which depicted an Ottoman sultan, in the harem and whatnot, the AKP officials were very upset because they said, oh, this is offending our, Ottoman past and our imperial legacy. So what about the tools and tactics they use? As both, Maria and Jackie have mentioned, these are, both hard and soft tools, direct and indirect. And they also, manage the information space and the media environment, not only through state media, but also, and more importantly, through commercial media. Because in the Turkish case, unlike the, Chinese party state, there is really no official, state newspaper. There is a state-run television and radio and state-run news agency, which are, of course, all, politicized. But I'll come back to this later. I will talk oh, I'm sorry. I want to talk a little bit about how they, manage the whole information space, especially through commercial media. So they're using, this is the typical sticks and carrots strategy, right? They have, we have seen, large numbers of, of journalists imprisoned, especially since 2007, 2008, as part of political investigations. They have been wiretapped, and, all these wiretapping, the wiretapping is still ongoing. When I interviewed journalists for my study a couple of years ago, and I asked them, do you think that you're wiretapped? They were like, yeah, of course, this is a given, so nobody's really, and they kind of gotten used to this. Also, when they wiretap the journalists, and then they, the transcripts of these conversations of journalists and politicians, they were splashed on pro-AKP newspapers, and which then, they used to do this, character assassination of certain journalists. Obviously, they use a lot of financial sticks, imposing, hefty tax fines on critical media outlets. They also limit the access of journalists to state officials or government officials by way of accreditation. One major tool for the AKP has been the cultivation of its own partisan media. So they have used a lot of carrots. And this is because, again, Turkish media system, yes, it is, very commercialized, but it's all these media outlets, televisions and newspapers, the business tycoons buy them, or they assume ownership of these outlets just to use them as bargaining chips. So to carry favors with the government, because although it's a the market logic prevails in the Turkish economic system, the state still plays a very major role, especially by way of distributing these privatization deals or state bids or government contracts, which could be in billions of dollars. They have been also channeling a lot of state advertising to partisan media, and loyalist journalists are obviously getting a lot of favorable treatment. So they are the ones, who end up traveling the world with Erdogan on his, the presidential jet. They get invited to, dinners and his newly, built palace. A tactic they used early on when they first came to power in 2002 was to meddle with the commercial media's ownership structures. And this they did by using the government agency TMSF, which is Savings Deposit Insurance Fund. This was right after the 2001 economic crisis that devastated Turkish economy. And at the end of this crisis, several conglomerates which owned banks, which owned media outlets, went bankrupt. So the TMSF took over these conglomerates or corporations and started selling off their media outlets in return for their debts. But while they were selling it, they were also repackaging the editorial board, moving, getting rid of editors and critical journalists, and kind of, packing these outlets with their, friendly partisan journals, and then, selling them to, again, friendly, Erdogan-friendly businessmen. So obviously, cultivation of partisan media that happened in, the AKP's first term, which even is ongoing. Only recently, I think last year, another television news channel was overtaken by TMSF for its financial problems, and then it was sold to another pro-AKP businessman. But the troubling thing for me here is how the AKP promoted all these, changes, ownership changes, as a sign of democratization. Erdogan, a couple of times in his public speeches, he said, we came to power by fighting with these, headlines, and now it is our turns to write our own headlines. So that was, I think, a direct reference to, now, the ownership is changing hands from the Kemalist, pro-military, secularist establishment. It is changing hands, but this is a good thing. This is democratization. And again, like with many of the the political trials, the political investigations into the military, this was again, I think, a false choice that they presented the public with. So, your run-of-the-mill changes, in editorial boards, layoffs of critical journalists, dismissals, and appointment of government operatives. So even though there are certain outlets, television, news channels, or newspapers that are on the surface, that are seemingly critical of the AKP, they, like have a few, like anchors, program hosts, producers, or columnists that were, like either Erdogan's press secretary a couple of years ago or former AKP parliamentarians, and suddenly you see them, like writing these columns. And mainstream media is, again, packaging this as, like, oh, we're so pluralistic, we open our doors to everyone, so we're not just, like, we don't just have, like these Kemalists or pro-military columnists, but look, it's all about freedom, so we also have pro-Erdogan columnists. Which brings me to, like the complicity of media organizations in all of this. And this goes back to my earlier point about Turkish media system being dominated by the economic elites, which again is not anything new, which has happened with the commercialization of the media system in the 1980s. In the 1980s and 1990s, media conglomerates had these political economic alliances or pacts with the military bureaucratic establishment. And since the early 2000s, their, like affiliations changed, and, like they are now they have entered into these, into similar pacts with the AKP. So under the pressures from AKP, like be it legal or financial, they responded in different ways. Some mainstream outlets, like I said, started to employ these government operatives or commissars, either at the executive level as managers or as part of their editorial boards. So it's, like a varying degree of, like how much they toe the line. Others, especially the pro-military secularist outlets, which, by the way, are much smaller when compared to the mainstream outlets, they amplified their anti-AKP rhetoric, but they became, like only further marginalized. And again, Erdogan is kind of using them as, like as a safety valve, and just say, like, look, they're out there, I'm not touching them, so we're free. And the media field has always been marked by these power inequalities. Your typical high barriers to entry, conglomeration, ownership by business tycoons, high politicization levels. So where are the, where are the alternatives? Are there alternatives? There are obviously, critical voices that do exist, both in the press, on television, and online. There are smaller, like newspapers with lower circulation numbers and newly established television channels that have a pro-Kurdish, anti-establishment, or pro-labor or leftist inclinations. But as I said, their circulation numbers are either low or the audience appeal is low. But there's a thriving internet culture that is pulsating against this mainstream landscape. A lot of attention has been paid to Twitter and use of online media, especially among activists, like how they organize, mobilize, etc. after the Gezi Park protests. But one point that I want to make is that this is not necessarily a novel development. This has been in the making. I mean, Turkey's internet culture, at least since the mid-1990s, like with steady internet user growth and the proliferation of platforms, etc., numbers, civil society organizations, activists, political activists, they all maintain an online presence. There are alternative news sites. There are also, like relatively big and independent news websites, a couple of them, T24 and Bianet. There is also much smaller dissident sites, especially pro-Kurdish, leftist, those affiliations. Yes, the traffic is increasing, internet use is increasing, citizen journalism is on the rise. There are civic initiatives that are especially engaged in things like election monitoring to make sure that AKP is not rigging the elections. So yes, the internet culture is lively and is thriving. But they are also under a lot of, like as Maria mentioned, there is this, like whole cat and mouse game, right? And the AKP is of course learning the game, and I think this falls aligned with what Mark Lynch says about the authoritarian persistence thesis, right? They adapt. They just do not surrender to these new technologies and give up. So what are they learning? Jackie mentioned this, first generation and next generation. So this is very much, like similar trends with, compared to Russia and China, blocking and filtering, and now they are moving towards warrantless surveillance. With they introduced a new intelligence bill. They are also doing a lot of state-sponsored information campaigns, very similar to the Russian case. That's why I put the, it's similar to Kremlin's troll army or the blogger army. This is new. So after the Gezi protests, the AKP, has seen how the dissidents and the opponents and the youth and the activists have used social media to mobilize, organize, etc., etc. And right after the Gezi protests, AKP, especially the youth branch, started this Twitter army, what they call the Twitter army. They're also referred to as, like the AK trolls, the AK trolls. So it's somewhere, I think, between 6,000 to 9,000. We do not know, nobody knows if they are paid, but they probably hire. They're probably members of the AKP youth organization. So there's a lot of, if not financial, a lot of political incentives there. And basically, they just want to delegitimize the dissident voices that are organizing online. So there is, again, this information war going on, this media war. How do you define the information space? And a lot of times they're getting into these battles, what is the trending topic in Turkey right now? Oh, it's, like a pro-AKP hashtag or an anti-AKP hashtag. Look, we made this hashtag our trending topic, so we're winning this war. But there are other hard tactics that the AKP is using, and I'm sure you heard about the Twitter and YouTube bans last year. Oh, okay, right. Both Twitter and YouTube were banned between March and May, and it was because all the evidence and the leaked tapes about Erdogan's corruption scandal were surfacing online. They introduced stricter legislation and new internet law. They're increasing the surveillance powers of the intelligence agency. They are also targeting individuals, especially on Twitter. They just proposed a new domestic or homeland security law, which will give the police increased powers, etc. They're also proposing amendments to press law, which I think resonates with what Jackie has mentioned. They're going to subject all website owners, even like bloggers and even online commentators, to press law provisions, which are very strict. So they will require website owners to obtain a masthead, which in Turkey, is very bureaucratic, and this will likely discourage a lot of people from going online. And recently, just 2-3 days ago, I came across these, reports from both, Facebook and Twitter. So yes, we do hold the world record and government requests to remove content from Twitter. So that's Turkey, 477 requests, followed by Russia and Germany. And most Facebook content censored by country, again, Turkey is leading. And these are mostly, either issues that have to do with national security, unity, identity, or blasphemy and protection of Islam. Recently, after Charlie Hebdo attacks in In Paris, a newspaper was subject to a lot of, government restriction because they wanted to reprint the cartoons. Or Facebook agreed to remove a lot of these, like Charlie Hebdo cartoons from certain user pages. So there is, as is clear by now, that there is a lot of, like control and management and obviously propaganda by way of state media. And there is also a lot of, like this tussle and contention, this back and forth between, like state and non-state actors, state and civil society, and also within different political groups. But obviously, I think the outcome is, like this narrowing of media culture. I'm going to stop here, but maybe we can talk more in the Q&A session. Again, as Jackie has said, this is, how do we look at all of these and like point to the connections in terms of like hybrid regimes, especially in non-Western contexts? How do these things play out? So that's it. Thank you.
Yeah, I guess we don't have too much time left, so we might end up taking questions instead of doing more discussion style. Yeah, so yeah, please, whoever has a question, just raise your hand.
Thank you so much for the three of you for very interesting and engaging presentations. And I cannot help but notice the parallel tides and trends that really kind of cross-cut the three presentations in terms of authoritarianism and resistance, diffusion and convergence, the learning curve by the activists and protesters and dissidents, but also the learning curves by the regimes in power, the push and pull mechanisms and the stick and the carrot. Let me just mention quickly in this regard, when you mentioned the Twitter army working on behalf of the regime, in a country like Syria, the electronic army works on behalf of the regime also to kind of, crush the protesters online and block and hack their websites and so on. So it seems that there are these parallel ties. My question to the three of you really is, do you see a trajectory of one of these trends kind of slowly or quickly or whatever you want to anticipate or predict, taking over the other? In other words, the balance is gonna, tip in the, favor of the activists or protesters or in favor of the regimes in power? Or do you see this kind of parallelism continuing for some time to come? So your projection in 5 years, in 10 years, in 15 years from now, are we gonna see a shift in favor of one force at the expense of the other, or are we going to still continue to see this kind of parallel tides, going side by side? And another quick question also, two of you have chosen to study countries other than your own. Maria, you're originally from Russia, and you've chosen to study China, and Jaclyn, you studied Russia, and I assume you're American, right? Yeah. So what are the pros and cons of studying a country other than your own? What are some of the advantages, the weak points, the strong points, the pros and cons of this? Thank you.
Great questions.
Well, regarding the first question, I'm not very, optimistic about where Turkey is headed. But I don't think the online or civil society-based initiatives or any opposition to AKP will disappear overnight. That's not going to happen. But I think this whole whack-a-mole game or cat and mouse game is going to go on. But what I'm seeing is that the AKP is, closing in. So those pockets of, that civic space or those spaces of dissent, I think they're going to become smaller and smaller. So it's kind of like this ghettoization, right, of civil society groups or political activists or digital activists, what have you. It's just getting narrower. And this is what they are, like that crazy printer you mentioned, right? They introduced like so many new laws within a matter of months, which are all kind of, again, interconnected with each other, right? So the internet law and the intelligence law and the new domestic security law, it's just, I think those spaces are becoming narrower and narrower. They're not going to disappear, but I think it's going to become much more difficult for activists, opponents, and dissidents to raise their voices.
Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, great questions. Thanks. I guess on the first question, I divided it into two parts. One is what is likely to be the trend in Russia, and the other is sort of how I see this globally playing out. In Russia, I'm not very optimistic at the moment either. It seems like it's sort of like the cat's out of the bag, to play on our cat and mouse analogy. In the past, there was sort of this facade of democracy. And you see this plays into the global question. You see this in a lot of these hybrid regimes. After the end of the Cold War, there was the emergence of these gray zone regime types that they at least had a facade of democratic institutions, but it was important to their narrative of legitimacy, both domestically and internationally. And there was sort of an absence of an alternative ideology. And so there was we're a democracy, we have democratic institutions, we have elections. And then you had the colored revolutions in the 2000s, various protest movements, the Arab Spring, around elections, and people and these regimes starting to question, well, can we continue to really pretend this? Or if we do, is that putting our durability at risk? And governments starting to sort of realize, well, if we want to stay in power, maybe we keep having elections, maybe we keep having fraudulent elections, but we can't continue to have an illusion at home of having this kind of, it's really free. We can clamp down now. So you've had, there were a lot of NGOs, media outlets, individual actors who seemed untouchable in Russia in the 2000s and who have now come under the hammer. Some of these online oppositional news outlets that no one thought the government would do anything about because they were the safety valve. They had fringe audiences, and now they're gone. They're blocked. Society is very creative. You've seen a real resurgence of activist sort of culture in Russia, but it's only specific communities, and a lot of them are leaving because people are there's only so much that they can take. Day after day, we didn't think it could get this bad. Now it's worse. What's going to happen tomorrow? And a lot of people immigrating as a result. In terms of the other question, one last thing on that. I think it just raises a really interesting question for the future of regime type, because obviously these new technologies have allowed globalization and the internet, sort of dual forces, have allowed less control of information than used to be possible while claiming to be a democracy. And so these middle regime types face a real decision point in the near future. And it's a question how those countries will evolve. Will you again have a black and white picture of authoritarian versus democracy with nothing in between? Or will there be some sort of other sort of state legitimization that emerges? In terms of studying a country other than my own, it's a great question. It's been a lot of fun. I got into it almost a little bit randomly in that I studied abroad in Russia as a college student, and I got fascinated. I think that it has pros and cons. Mostly for me, it's been pros because it's been a great learning experience. I've built great friendships and connections there. The cons probably are because I don't have the same sort of connection as if it were where my family is or something like that. There's a feeling of, I have to keep going back in order to not feel distance, in order to not feel too disconnected, because that's easier to let happen when you don't have roots there. But yeah, I recommend it. It's fascinating.
Okay, so great questions. On the first question about this parallels and who wins, I think I have trouble with this question because I think it's not about one versus the other. I don't see it in this black and white kind of way. And I don't see it as optimistic versus pessimistic either. I think as scholars, we're observing the evolution of this landscape, and I wouldn't say that I'm optimistic or pessimistic. I would say that this notion of kind of coexistence between so-called civil society actors and authorities have different shades. They're different shades of gray. So this shades keeps changing from maybe one degree of gray to another and constantly evolving. So it's hard to say one is sort of losing altogether, or one is on top of it. And also the relationship between a lot of civil society actors and the regime, I think in China, has been quite collaborative actually. A lot of actors are embedded in the system, and in fact they're not looking to overthrow it either. So in my research I'll focus a lot on this aspect of collaboration as opposed to kind of dissent. So a lot of them, most of them aren't even dissidents. But the troubling thing is when pressures keep rising, and the space becomes more and more narrow for these forms of collaboration, then perhaps some of these more cooperative kind of attitudes might shift towards, outright dissent or fleeing the country. So in that case, I think that the issue is more about how the society evolves, what kind of voices are there being, sort of feeding into policy apparatus in the case of China, as opposed to just like who is winning, because it's not clear what system would take place in China, as a kind of alternative to the current one. So I think it's really important to kind of carefully observe these dimensions and to treat it as this kind of ever-evolving amorphous, phenomenon, as opposed to sort of focusing on like one versus the other. So that's how I would, I guess, try to answer that. And as for studying the other country than your own, I actually focus on Russia as well to a more limited extent. But I've had experience, doing both sort of your own, so to speak, country, even though I was actually born in Latvia, not Russia. But China obviously being much more foreign to me. And you do have ups and downs in both cases. So in the case of China, yes, you come as an outsider, and in some ways people might sort of open up in a different ways because they think of you as a little bit more naive, I guess, as well. You are an outsider, so they will kind of keep speaking and repeating certain things and underlining them, and you might learn a lot about how they perceive some aspects of their society as being just completely outside, of their own. They might feel more free to talk to you about some issues. You're not coming from their network. You're not going to kind of inform anybody else within that network. You're just coming in as a kind of this observer. On the other hand, in Russia, coming in as a Russian speaker, being treated purely as a Russian, I found myself having kind of dual pressures. On the one hand, it's like, oh, okay, you're one of us, so you should understand all of us anyway. Like, there's no need to explain, so you get it, right? And you kind of sit down, it's like, okay, fine, I guess I do sort of culturally get it more. But some things are not as clear as a parent, and you have a lot of pressure on just being like one of them immediately. So if you don't get something, it's kind of looked as very, silly or kind of, there's a sense of treating you as like, as one of their tribe, which means that if you get something wrong, they immediately kind of kick you out. It's very judgmental. So it's tricky. You have a lot of pressure coming in. It's like being really prepared for the interview and really understanding how things play out in the system before asking any questions. In fact, they ask you many questions before they allow you to ask your own. So it's different kinds of dimensions, but both are really, I think, important and worthwhile. Thank you. Oh, yeah? Carlin? And Omar?
Yeah, so first, thank you all for the uplifting picture, very cheery picture of all three countries. I'm curious about the effect of these control mechanisms on the flow of foreigners into these countries and the flow of natives out of the country. So a very funny thing to me, not really funny, strange thing happened in China the other day. There have been some statements in China suggesting that Chinese who go overseas and get foreign degrees and then come back might be a kind of fifth column, might be traitors, might be bringing in Western values and so on. And we know, as you mentioned, that there's a push now against Western values. And then Global Times ran an editorial directly against this, saying this is a type of factionalism that we don't want to see happen. These Chinese who are coming back to China are patriots, and they're going to help, and they're not going to bring in Western values. So all of this is happening at the same time. We have the 10-year visas suddenly agreed to, right? What do you see as the connection, this for Maria, what's the connection between the greater control taking place and what seems to be a sense that China doesn't want Chinese kept from going to the United States or going to other places? It's not clear how much they want the American business community to emigrate. A lot of American business people are thinking of leaving. At the same time, China just extracted a $975 million fine, so that's good money, right? Yeah. What's the effect there? And I think there's a similar situation in Russia now where a lot of expatriates are thinking, we need to get out of here. How do we get out of here and hold on to some of our assets because things are going to get a lot worse? Do you see a similar connection there?
We'll just take a question from Omar as well.
I just wanted to comment on the aspect of hybridity. In thinking about it, while it's obviously clear that the three countries are good examples of kind of hybrid control, but does that assume that there are non-hybrid systems in a sense? So pushing that question, do you think these countries are actually models of, in general, even to Western countries, in how the changing technologies and changing government reactions to them require new approaches of management and control?
Okay, great question. I'll just start briefly with the China question on greater control versus globalization, right? So I think those two dimensions, dynamics, have been playing out for a long time now. It's not like a new thing. The government always tries to restrain certain areas while maintaining its global presence. I mean, China is one of the most economically vibrant, right, and open societies as well. There are so many people willing to go there. At the same time as they're many fleeing the country, there are many young people who are going to China to, explore new opportunities. So the two are like two contradictions taking place at once, and I think that kind of characterizes the Chinese mode of governance in many ways. They're full of contradictions. Just because one sort of pressure is taking place doesn't mean that the other one cannot coexist simultaneously. So I would say that's going to continue, but in some ways it can be counterproductive, because if you do crack down significantly on the internet or the VPNs and the business simply slows down, how is that going to affect foreign companies? Perhaps some of them might have to reconsider their investment in China. But I wouldn't be surprised if this kind of crackdown also sort of subsides over time and things become a little more flexible, particularly for foreign companies, like that, the government will adjust and kind of show it as a threat, but then say, okay, we don't want all of you to leave, so we'll keep it a little bit more, mild and accessible. So I think the adaptation is likely to take place to maintain, the economic ties to the world. And on the hybridity, I think it's a great question as well, and I agree that maybe there isn't like a type that's not hybrid. I mean, everything is a mix of different types of modes of control, and some of them are kind of carrots, some of them are sticks, like you mentioned, and that is true, I think, all across three cases. Maybe we can talk about like North Korea as the kind of mode of complete and utter control, but even in that case, there's probably like carrot and sticks involved. So perhaps like they're just different forms of hybridity that we can compare and contrast, but there isn't one unified kind of opposite way that's not hybrid, I think. So that's really a good point on how to theorize about that. And also in terms of exporting to Western countries, I think it's a great point, and there's a lot of that happening with kind of technology actually being exported, some of it from China to the UK. That's like a recent thing, but there's also modes of surveillance that are being implemented in the US. They're a little bit similar to China now, which I call like kind of feedback mechanisms. The government here is actively also surveilling public opinion and responding to various opinions in the form of policy changes, the same way, very similar way that Chinese government is. It's kind of a more efficient form of technocratic governance. And I think it's a really interesting change, which is perhaps coming from China, so something to observe. Thank you.
Yeah, very interesting questions on the issue of globalization and control mechanisms and migration, I guess. It seems to me that in Russia, in the past, there's definitely been this sort of back and forth. There's a desire to keep those communities there to some extent, and that's always been balanced to some extent with other pressures and desires to control. I think these days, we'll see which direction it goes in the next year or so, but right now there's a real backlash against everything Western. And so, I mean, I've gone to Russia numerous times over the last decade and a half, and I have never until this time, this last year I was there, been asked before, what are you doing here from our enemy country? Several people. It surprised me.
Not friendly.
Yeah, and said with a smile. By people who didn't mean it as an insult to me. It just seemed like the natural thing to say, I guess. And this sort of thing was shocking in a way, because you see fluctuations in the attitude toward the West very often in Russia, but this is more extreme. And you see this, though, in the community of people, speaking of globalization, the community of people who have absorbed more Western values, who travel a lot overseas, who have friends overseas, feel this themselves. This is in Moscow and St. Petersburg, in the major cities, people who are part of the sort of young, tech-savvy elite who are activists feel like they are isolated. And then one friend of mine said to me last year, every time I think about the polling data, I get freaked out, and then I open Facebook and I feel better because I see all my friends on Facebook, because that's what the activist community uses to discuss the issues. We'll see which way the pendulum swings in the next year. It's really unclear whether it's possible for it to be as closed off from the world as the regime seems to be pushing for right now. And it is using this language of the fifth column and these sorts of things. In terms of the question of hybridity, I guess I think it's a really good question. Political scientists deal with these discussions of regime type all the time, and I think come up with somewhat clunky categorizations quite often. And I guess with this one, it seems like the different regime types that exist at any given moment in time globally are have two sets of relationships, one to each other, and some sort of polarization or relationship to how they see each other globally as actors, and the other to what's going on in the world in terms of technology, in terms of globalization. And you have some very new pressures right now with the pressures of the internet and globalization, which are changing that picture. And there's some issues that all states are wrestling with transparency, the balance between privacy and security. And so that's really changing up the picture of regime type and how it splits up across states right now. It's an interesting picture to watch going forward.
Oh, okay. That's a lot of pressure.
Serious.
All right. Okay. About the implications on like foreigners and Turkey's relationship with the West has been very ambivalent, especially like during the final years of the Ottoman Empire and also the very early years of the New Republic in the 1920s and 30s. So there has been this top-down imposed Westernization and modernization program in Turkey, trying to emulate this model of Western rationality, like clothing, alphabet, and this and that. Several reforms have did take place. But also there is a lot of anti-Western rhetoric, especially in terms of, oh, what are the Western values doing to our, moral values and to Turkish family structure. So as you were talking about, the attack on, the Western values and Western technology companies, that totally resonates with the Turkish case. And again, the Turkish experience is ambivalent. So you hear Erdogan vilifying Twitter because he argues, this is a Western company that is bent on destroying, the Turkish unity and national sovereignty. And on the other hand, he has the 6,000 people on Twitter, and he recently started tweeting himself. So obviously, I think they're just trying to figure out what to do. But going back to the question of the foreigners, so yes, there is a lot of appeals to especially foreign capital, foreign investment to come to Turkey. This has been one of the driving forces behind the Turkish economy over the past 10 years in terms of its improvement and whatnot. But also the rhetoric is very anti-Western, I would say, because a lot of times whatever domestic issues that are going on in Turkey, it gets to be blamed on these foreign conspiracies. So the whole Gezi Park protest, according to the AKP and Erdogan, it was the work of foreign conspirators, the Jewish lobby, trying to bring down the Turkish economic miracle because they were just jealous, because they don't want Turkey to be the new leader in the Middle East or the new global leader. But on the other hand, they need to make sure that the foreign capital and investment, and there's this continuous inflow of foreign money that's coming to Turkey. But recently there's been a shift. They're not maybe more they're not that worried about the Western investment leaving the country, because now they have these new political and economic alignments with the Gulf dollars, with the petrodollars and Gulf money. So that's where a lot of Arab sheiks, Arab investment bankers and this and that, they're bringing hot money to Turkey, which is keeping the economy going for a while, but we don't know what happens. And again, their economic policy is very shaky in terms of foreign investment. Going back to Omar's question about the hybrid regime, I've had frustrating moments with coming up with a certain terminology, because a lot of times I've seen political analysts writing about Turkey as taking that detour toward illiberal democracy, using Zakaria's terminology. But I think the problem is we are starting to work with these Western models, and kind of applying this European or North American based typology to a non-Western context. Because I've had trouble with illiberal democracy, because liberalism or liberal values in Turkey, to begin with, it really doesn't apply to the Turkish case. I'm kind of looking at and thinking about a lot of, Polanca's work on authoritarian statism and authoritarian neoliberalism, because he was, basically looking at the 1970s and 80s and what's going on, in the European context with all these changes that we now term, globalization and neoliberalization. And Stuart Hall also writes about, authoritarian populism. And if you're interested, and I think there is a great article by Ian Brough on the rise of authoritarian neoliberalism, especially after the 2007 global recession and, the austerity measures in Europe and whatnot, and how the states, the European states, right, are kind of gearing up or strengthening themselves by way of these, legal changes or constitutional changes so they can kind of, exclude or marginalize particular dissent that, could be social dissent, political dissent, or economic dissent. And I find, authoritarian neoliberalism and Polanca's work useful in the Turkish case because it helps me to kind of move away from that that typical framing of Turkey, state versus, people, or secular versus religious, or Atatürk republics versus, the new Islamist government, because, those binary oppositions do not really capture, I think, the complexity. Yeah.
Thanks. Please join me in thanking our speakers.
Thank you.